Welcome to Modern Learning on the Air, the InSync Training podcast, in conversation with some of the top leaders and thinkers in the modern virtual learning space. We'll learn about the latest virtual classroom techniques, creative training initiatives, and virtual training best practices that will engage and empower your teams, colleagues, and learners. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Modern Learning on the Air. I'm Jeff Brown, the Creative Director at InSync, and in this episode, we're diving deeper into our exploration of redefining workforce development. Joining us today are two esteemed guests, Dr. Charles Dye, Director of Research at InSync, and Jennifer Hofmann, our Founder and Chief Strategist. Together, we'll unravel the complexities of tailoring learning content for global enterprises while addressing regional nuances. Stay tuned as we discuss strategies to engage diverse audiences and ensure the effectiveness of virtual learning across borders. Now let's get started. Charles, Jennifer, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Hi, Chip. How are you today?
Great, Jennifer. How are you?
I'm doing great. And I'm excited about our conversation today because it's important and it's timely. We're talking about how to create content that works for the global enterprise but is relevant to different regions. And so before we jump into how to do that, I want your take on what we mean by creating regionalization for a global program.
It's a great opening statement. I think the idea here is to set operational definitions. Regionalization has to do with establishing a messaging that is consistent with the cultural, societal, behavioral expectations within any particular region of the global economy. Globalization has to do with an enterprise-wide, how do you make a transnational corporation all work towards the same goal? In the context of learning and development, it's a little bit more nuanced. The idea is that every region, whether it be the European Union, North American Trade Organization, the Pacific Rim, all of these regions have expectations about what training will accomplish and what it is meant to do. And our goal as learning and development professionals is to make sure that the training meets those needs of each learner in each region. It's really important to understand that regionalization isn't translation. A lot of people hear the word and they think, oh, I'll just translate it to French or German or Russian or Chinese. Certainly translation can be part of regionalization, but it's not necessarily a requirement. Rather, regionalization has to do with bringing out regionally relevant elements in your instruction and making sure that the learner understands that this is conveyed to them because they're in that region. As an example, in the European Union, there is a set of regulations called GDPR, and many people listening to this podcast may groan a little bit when they think about it. It was implemented in late 2018, and it was passed as a European Union set of regulations. But globally, the handling of information associated with personal identification, PII is the term of art, changed everywhere. So there was a regional requirement that changed a global practice. And so we might imagine that how I handle that kind of personally identifiable information in the US would be one way, but it would be very different in the EU. So if I'm training someone on, for example, inbound marketing, I need to make sure that the people working with that information in the EU treat it differently than they would in the US. Otherwise, we would expose the organization to government oversight or sanction.
Chip, we've always had global organizations trying to roll out programs to all of the countries involved in their organization. Why is it different now, this importance of regionalization?
There's a couple factors that have kind of converged at the same time. The first, of course, is the increasingly global economy. For the last 50 years, we've evolved from transnational corporations that were really based in one country and doing business around the globe to really companies that have substantial economic and physical presence in a whole host of different regions. Another factor that's going on is the increasing regionalization of economies. You see it in the news all the time. The Pacific Free Trade Pact, the European Union, of course, North America, and the South American economies all working together. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic forced a hybrid workforce into being. It certainly existed before that, but now roughly 40% of labor hours delivered to the world economy are delivered from a hybrid worker, and that's a big number. So if you look at those things on the outside and kind of evaluate them and how they work together, it's very obvious that you could have a worker supporting services in the United Kingdom, working from the Czech Republic and using a server in China. So it is necessary for the worker to be trained within the region they're in for the services they're providing, as opposed to I show up and I do my manufacturing job in the country I've always done it.
Well, before we get into how we make this happen, I've got one more, which I think an important clarifying question. Now that we're delivering so much content virtually using products like MS Teams and Zoom and WebEx, we have multiple cultures, multiple countries, multiple regions, all in the same live events. Is it possible to get this regionalization you're talking about when we're combining cultures at the same time?
There are a couple different approaches to that challenge. This is one of those you never step in the same river twice kind of problems. You can convene a session and have people that are all from the EU and then have one for East Coast US, for example, but the people that didn't make the one for the EU show up. And now you as a learning and development stakeholder have to figure out how to do that. First, some people adopt kind of the strong arm approach of saying, okay, if you're not in the North American Trade Organization, you don't attend to this training. That is certainly an approach. The problem with that, I think, is that you lose a diversity of viewpoint within the session. You might imagine that different markets operate at different levels of maturity based on how long they've been in existence and how long they do things. And as a learning and development professional, if you, and I know you have, had the opportunity to deliver to a bunch of international audiences, they look at things simply differently. And I think those different viewpoints bring something home to all learners when they're in the same session. A question from someone who's been dealing with GDPR every day, for example, has a very different working level experience with that and will ask a much more pointed question about it than someone that's just hearing about it for the first time. And so I think learners that are in that kind of diverse audience, in the sense of diverse from different markets, benefits from it in the learning and development context.
Well, it's like we always like to say, when we teach people how to learn in this kind of hybrid, multi-regional environment, we're also teaching them how to work and communicate and collaborate in that same environment, because they're one and the same nowadays.
That's exactly right. When in the late 90s, a set of series of studies came out, most recent of which of the progeny was March 1st of this year, just a few weeks ago. And what they're looking at is implementation of transnational corporations, organizations, and how they have effectively implemented kind of an organization-wide initiative, whatever it happens to be. And what they've found is one, training plays a key role in that, in the sense that I can get a consistent message out to everybody. But if the learning and development program was regionalized and tailored to different regional requirements, they found the companies were more effective at implementation, they were more profitable, they were more effective at getting the message out consistently. So this is a question to some extent about how do you describe a message to people in different cultures. You know, culture plays a part of this. A good friend of mine used to say, if you want to chuckle, go Google how a dog barks in a dozen different languages. They are wildly different noises, but it's the same dog barking. The goal is to get people to listen to the same message and hear it the way you want them to hear it. In the past 5 years, the hybrid workforce has kind of driven that point home, Jennifer. If you think about it, we have people scattered to the four winds delivering services remotely or learning and development and attending learning and development interventions remotely. And they still have a need to have that kind of tailored messaging delivered to them, regardless of where they happen to be.
So like anything to do with learning and development, no matter how we deliver it and who we're delivering it to, it comes down to design and development. So how does the development team approach this concept of regionalization in a global rollout?
It's a great question. And I think, let me say at the beginning, you don't have to solve it all at once. The goal is to regionalize and deliver a tailored message. What is important to understand for the design and implementation team is that the learning objectives haven't changed. What we want the learner to walk away with is the same, whether it be declarative knowledge or some kind of new understanding of policy or training in a new skill. Whatever it happens to be, their learning objectives haven't changed. But as we said, maybe how you teach someone in the European Union might be different than you teach someone in Australia versus someone you teach in China or Japan. Generally speaking, an approach to design might be commonality elements are delivered commonly, not unusual. We've done this many times for what I would call multi-threaded interdisciplinary topics. You teach the basics of software as a service to everybody. This is what it means. It's kind of the declarative knowledge, declarative recall stuff that you want to just convey to everybody so everyone has a working understanding, just like we did when we talked about regionalization versus globalization. But then, for those that are attending from the EU, you say, okay, instead of just A, B, and C, you get A, B, and D, because the way you handle PII will be different than the way the person in Canada will, or the way someone in Australia might deliver to Japan a different treatment than they would treat if they were delivering to the US. This isn't rocket science here. But the designers really need to think about what is common versus what is unique. And then we give them essentially a regional supplement so that the messaging delivered to that person in that region is meaningful.
You said we could get the declarative knowledge, the stuff that is very consistent, and we can teach that to everyone at the same time. Is there an opportunity for different regions to actually collaborate during live sessions?
Yes, and that's a great question. In fact, I think a good way to start an implementation like this is first, look at everyone's calendars, because someone in China might have a week-long holiday period in the middle of your implementation in October, or someone might have a holiday in the early spring that you've never heard of before, but it's a national holiday and no one's going to be in the classroom. The worst thing you can do is pretend it doesn't matter and try and force learners to attend. But for a variety of reasons. One, they don't feel like they've been observed or seen, but aside from kind of the latent emotional effects, there are really lost opportunities if someone isn't attending with their head in the game. If you choose to deliver to multiple time zones or multiple regions at the same time, then you need to start thinking about selection of time of delivery, length of delivery, and that kind of thing to make sure that people have the chance to attend at a reasonable hour and really interact and engage with the content the way they want.
It sounds like a lot of work, both from the designer's perspective and from the learner's perspective. They've got a lot of cognitive investment in this. What if we don't do it?
Well, the consequences of not doing, aside from all the good things that happen when you do regionalize, you're more profitable, more effective, more efficient, you lose those benefits. And if your competition is doing it, you've got a challenge ahead. But the other real problem is that you are leveraging a lot of the information process load onto the learner who may not be really invested or capable of learning what's important and what isn't. If I'm teaching a topic and it's tailored for North America and someone is attending from a different region with a wildly different regulatory schema and set of company practices because of that regulatory scheme, I could actually be doing what I call negative training. When I deliver the training and the person comes out ready to do damage to the organization rather than moving the ball forward because they were trained improperly. And so what we want to do is approach these kinds of challenges with a universal design mindset. I design things that are accessible by most learners, if not all learners, with the appropriate levels of accommodation. In this case, that might be a supplement for their region or some direct translated materials that will support the training that they can take to supplement their instruction so that now the learners are not the ones forced into the role of figuring out what's accurate and what isn't.
I want to add something there. When we have these multiple cultures and multiple languages, and the facilitator is delivering in English, for example, even if that is the language of the company, the language of the way we do business, we can support learners with producers and technical hosts that actually do know their language and understand their culture, and they can be an advocate for those learners.
Yeah, that's actually of profound importance. Anyone that's worked in the regionalization and translation industry knows that there is a big difference between what I would call conversational language and then technical language. And in most cases, our training is revolving around technical training of some form, whether it be soft skills, technical skills, what have you. And as a consequence, putting a natural language speaker that can support in English, but also has a strong background in the native language, provides inordinate benefit to the learners. I know at InSync, we do that as a practice. And the reason is not because it's a requirement of the client, but it's our strongest recommendation because we're about the learner. And if the learner comes out of that training with a negative experience, it goes back to the point you made earlier, Jennifer. We work as we learn. If I learn it's hard to collaborate across regions, I may not be inclined to do it next time. Mm-hmm. So instead, if I make it an engaging experience that they walk away with a positive impression, that whole idea of negative training goes away. And instead, they walk out with something that is meaningful to them, and they got to hear viewpoints from other regions.
What do we need to watch out for when we're regionalizing content?
I think the biggest single pitfall of regionalizing content is assumptions. Assumptions about delivery infrastructure, deliveries or assumptions about content, assumptions about culture expectations, gender identities, roles within a company. You should, as a designer, design for the worker you want and let the workforce rise to that requirement. And if you do that, you will be pleasantly surprised by how people from diverse backgrounds come into a session and can pick apart the most nuanced, sophisticated elements of a topic because they all have a unique perspective that they can share. And, the person that isn't a contributor perhaps will hear that and say, oh, that's why in the Czech Republic, they never ask for your name. They always address you as sir, for example, or what have you, making it up. The idea here is that the learners are smart people and they can figure out what the expectation is. And if you talk to them in a language that is relevant to their context, it's appreciated, and they are much more likely to kind of dispense with the front matter and get right into the meat of the topic. And that's what we want of our learners.
So do you have any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I think the big takeaways from regionalization are, one, this isn't just translating it to a foreign language. This is about managing a whole set of different inputs into your training content to make it more relevant for the individual learner. If we go back to adult learning principles, we know relevance is a big, big deal. Adult learners, particularly in today's economy, don't really have a lot of time for nice to know information. So if you tailor their training to their needs, then they're far more likely to engage and put whatever they've learned into practice. I think the other big thing is, if you think that regionalization is hard, start small, start with a common calendar that everyone can accommodate, put in some significant regionally relevant references, have perhaps a regional SME take a look at it to make sure that it makes sense for how to sell software as a service in India, for example. And then once you've got that done, deliver it and get feedback and refine the messaging. The big thing, the big takeaway here, Jennifer, is if your company is not tailoring the content to a regional audience, and there are a bunch of them out there, different regions, you are at a competitive disadvantage. And that is a challenge that the front office really does not like to hear. It is not a huge effort to get started and to move the ball along so that everyone gets the training they need that's relevant for them.
Well, we've got a hybrid workforce working in a global economy, and everybody's on the move. And the one thing we can depend on is that change is a constant. So, Chip, thanks so much for this conversation today. I'm sure we'll have additional conversations about it. And I hope that you'll join us again.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. It was fun talking to you.
Thank you for tuning into Modern Learning on the Air. For all your training and services needs, visit us at insynctraining.com. And don't forget to sign up for our monthly webinars, where we cover key topics and trends in the learning and development space. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.